Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Shibley Telhami, who holds the Anwar Sadat Chair for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland. A political scientist, his many publications include Power and Leadership in International Bargaining, The Path to the Camp David Accords. Shibley, welcome to Berkeley.
My pleasure to
welcome
be
back to Berkeley.
Absolutely. I feel like this is a home for me.
We'll talk about that in a minute, but let's start from the beginning. Where were you born and raised?
I was born in a little village, an Arab village, near the city of Haifa. It's on the highest peak of Mount Carmel, overlooking the Mediterranean, a wonderful setting. Although it's only about 15 minutes from the city of Haifa. When I grew up in the 50s, I was born in 1951. In those years, the village was highly underdeveloped. The road to Haifa made Haifa seem like a continent away. The village didn't have running water, did not have electricity. It was very much a village, and it was rare that I, as a child, would go to Haifa. Transportation existed, but not on a regular basis, and typically children did not make it into the city very often.
So you were an Arab, and your faith was Christian?
That's right. The village itself, a majority of the people in the village were Druze. Druze are a derivative of Islam, but they have their own independent religion. In the village, there was also a Christian minority, and also an Arab Christian minority, of which my family was a member. And there was also a very small Muslim community as well.
But you were a citizen of the State of Israel.
That's right. I was born after Israel was created in 1940. I was born in 51, and so I grew up as a citizen of Israel up until I came to this country.
In this context, did the isolation of the village preclude your being subject as a child to much discrimination?
Yeah, there's no question about it. It was really an ordinary village life. There was not a sense of confrontation and subjugation. There was a sense of tension. There's a sense of questions about identity. I also grew up in a very egalitarian family. My father had been the first person from the village to ever get high school education. I had to go far away to get it and stay in a boarding school to get it. So he was considered to be an educated person, in fact, in some ways the most educated person. And during the war in 1948, he actually got another person who had just gone to high school, and together they opened the school in the system to keep the kids out of trouble during the war on their own with no compensation. And so they started the school system in there. And so there was a sense of education and the importance of education. There was a sense of civic duty and a sense of egalitarianism. There was not and in part I think is because of my father's own education out in a boarding school that was British style on the border between then Palestine and Lebanon, that he had he considered himself sort of a child of the Enlightenment. He was going through his own age of reason, and so to him identities didn't matter. They mattered then only politically, but to him in terms of the moral view of who he was, he didn't think of he was not a religious person. So he didn't think of his Christian identity as an identity. He didn't differentiate in the village context between Druze and Muslim and Christian. In fact, he was highly respected by all. And in fact, became a community leader, and at some point was the deputy mayor of the village. He himself comes from a family of leadership that was also considered egalitarian. His father was the Mukhtar of the village, the equivalent of the mayor of the village. And Druze and Christians and Muslims related to him in the same way. They all had Jewish friends from Haifa, very, very close Jewish friends, prior to 1948, that were completely unrelated to politics. There was a sense of close friendships that are still ongoing, by the way, that sort of transcended politics from the 30s, 40s till now. Very, very close, meaning, people who you can count on in hardships, to whose weddings and so forth you go, and you expect the same, people who would stay overnight at your homes. So there was a sense of egalitarianism, I think, that was that no doubt affected me personally in my own upbringing early on, both in terms of my emphasis on the importance of education, and in my sort of the focus on egalitarianism, even as I am very aware of the competing tensions in my own identity.
So was it this background that put you on the path to becoming interested in the study of international politics?
I wouldn't say so. It's kind of an interesting thing to look back, and obviously one tries to make sense of one's life and the path that one takes, and you wonder always whether you're just rationalizing the path or not. But I have always been interested throughout my life, even in elementary education, in politics and in writing. And clearly, you couldn't grow up in that environment in the 50s, 60s, and not be interested in war and peace. I mean, that was what was around you. And yet, I went through an educational system, which was really the Israeli educational system, although my high school was a private high school in Haifa, that essentially didn't give you much choices. I mean, it was rigid, where if you were a good student, you went into science and math, and no one at the time who was considered to be a bright student would go to study things like history or politics, or these are all for people who are second tier in that school system, which was unfortunate. And I think things have changed. At least I hope they've changed since. And as a consequence, I was drawn to, of all the sciences, so-called, I was actually drawn to mathematics, which was the most theoretical, because that was the way my mind worked. And so my focus was actually on mathematics. And my first degree was in mathematics. When I came to this country, and I look back at it, it's been an interesting time, because when I was in high school, I began thinking about what I would do after high school. It was 1967. I was in 10th grade, I believe, and I remember exactly June 5, 1967, when I was taking the final examination for that school year. I was in the middle of all the exams, and this was a private Arab high school, but had to obviously fit into the Israeli school system, and therefore the curriculum was defined by the school system in Israel. We were taking biblical Hebrew. And the exam was in biblical Hebrew. We had just taken the first portion of the exam. We came out to the break, and it was a tense time already, and we were all tuned to the news in the break, and we would hear on the radio that was being heard by the custodian of the village that war had just broken out, and they canceled the exams. So we were all excited about canceling the exams, and went home to watch essentially some of the air battles at night from top of the roofs, find the aircraft zooming and hear the bombings. But after the war, I was contemplating whether, given the tension that was there, whether I'd even have a future, given my own ambitions there. And I began exploring the possibility of studying overseas. When I applied to school, I had no idea about where to apply. I have, in my village, no one knew a thing about it. I had a friend of mine from high school who put me in touch with a small college in Nebraska called York College. And I actually applied to it, and I believe I got accepted, but I couldn't go because I didn't have enough money to go at the time, and it turned out to be a Bible college of all things, which I had no idea at the time. It was just sort of an incidental. But when I ultimately came after high school to study in the University of New York, Queens College, math was already pre-chosen for me in my own mind. It wasn't an issue of making a new selection. It was predetermined. And by the time I got to the end of that, I was beginning to come to terms with my own passions. And I was beginning to ask questions about my own identity, about my own role, about my own interest. And that's when it all started, the path that drew me ultimately to Berkeley.
Where you got your PhD and where you worked with Ken Waltz, who was one of the great intellectual influences on your thinking about international relations.
No question about it. But it was not a direct path. When I finished mathematics, the first thing that I was thinking about is philosophy and world religions, because it was right after the '73 war. And I was worried at the time, and this is interesting in a way in my intellectual development. At the time, I believed that the trouble in the Middle East may emanate from religious sources. That was the perspective I took as a sort of a distant observer. So it drew me to study philosophy, mindset, religion, and I came to Berkeley initially not to the Department of Political Science, but to do a special program between the Graduate Theological Unit and the Berkeley Philosophy Department. And I work with a number of people in the philosophy department who influenced me a lot. Benson Mates, who was then the chairman of the department, and I was drawn to analytic philosophy because of my mathematics, and we worked very closely. John Searle, I took a lot on language, philosophy of language with him, because I was also interested in language. But I was also drawn through the connection with the Graduate Theological Union to Søren Kierkegaard, who I think, despite my interest in analytic philosophy, fascinated me because of the focus on the division within the self, within the soul, and because of all the competing tensions that I was having about who I am as a newly, sort of increasingly American, but with these components, the Arab component, the Israeli component, the Christian component, all of that coming together. And yet I'm an egalitarian, and I don't want these, and how do they come together? And the wonder of Kierkegaard, the fascination was about this, the theory that the self is made up of many different parts that come together in a way that can be transcended. And so I took that, and then I took that with the intention of somehow figuring out how to make sense of the Middle East. I went to the Middle East in 1976. I went to Egypt and Israel with the intention of tailoring a PhD program beyond the master's that would make use of these ideas that I developed here. And it was during that year, in 1976, in which I actually spent time on the ground thinking that I'm going to find links between religion and politics that are going to inspire me about how to proceed, that I came back and I've concluded that the causes are not in religion per se, that religion is a vehicle, that this is really about politics and economics, not about religion. And it wasn't about faith. And it was that conclusion in 1976 that propelled me to come back here and change course and to say that I'm going to become a political scientist. And it was here that then I came and pursued a political science degree at Berkeley and encountered Ken Waltz, who was really my first sort of encounter with international relations theory. I had practically no background in political science because of math and philosophy. It was not really, political science was very non-existent in my background. It was in my skin, but not in my background, academic background. And my encounter with Waltz was very special because I read, even before I met him, as I was preparing to look into, what to pursue. I read the book Man, State, and War, which has been a classic book. And that book influenced me a lot intellectually, even before I met Ken, in large part because its style was so analytical. And I was drawn to analytical because of my background. This is the way my mind works. So that alone fascinated me. It was a way for me to put an analytical framework into a subject that I'm very interested in. But it also in part because it provided answers that transcended these variables that I had already concluded are not at the core of the Middle East conflict. So I had already rejected in my own minds that this is about religion, this is about individuals per se, but it's about politics and political structures and economic structures. So the Waltzian framework fit nicely into a conclusion that I had already made in my own minds about the Middle East.
Now, our time is limited and we want to cover other things, but I think it's important for us to look at your first major work as a political scientist, which was on the Camp David Accords and the negotiation of a peace treaty between Israel and Sadat, which was totally unexpected. So how did all of what you've just talked about come together intellectually so that you could grapple with the problems of the Middle East?
Well, the one thing that the Middle East literature was full of in those years is a literature that looked at the Middle East as a peculiar region, as a region that sort of didn't fit into our scheme of international politics, as being sort of inherently unstable, as being full of leaders or regimes that didn't make any sense. There was a sense of irrationality about the Middle East as portrayed not only by the popular media, but really by some scholars as well, and certainly by policymakers. Now, the Waltzian frame and my own conclusions that had even preceded that in my own minds provided a way to understand what seemed to be puzzling events that fits nicely into the rest of international politics. And in this particular case, it was clear to me that to look at why Egypt severed essentially its relations with Pan-Arabism and moved into a relationship with Israel, that can be explained not merely by focusing on Sadat himself as an individual, not merely by focusing on some peculiar domestic variables that happen to explain it, or by looking at it as an unpredictable event in international politics, but by looking at a broader historical perspective and understanding the role of power. I think what I got out of Waltz especially, and I think what I got out of, certainly he's not the only one, but clearly the element that he focused most specifically is the distribution of military and economic power in the global community as a structural feature that constrains at a minimum what states do or don't do. And I was able to show by focusing on these variables in the Egyptian case and looking at it in a regional and global view that the changes in distribution of power had a dramatic impact on how Egypt viewed its interest and how Israel viewed its interest, leading to the Camp David negotiations. Where I have that insight, by the way, it still inspires me. That is my starting point in looking at international politics. What has happened since then, I would say, is that I have moved a bit away from it, not moved away from it as a starting point, but that framework did not provide answers to motives of states. It said, essentially, the more powerful a state is, the more it can do, the more it can get away with. It explains why one state prevails over another state. It explains why, in some instances, it explains motives. In some instances, it explains motives, particularly when security is at stake. But by and large, motives of states are not explained by the structure of power globally. let's take the example of the United States. I mean, Waltz himself, when he looks at the history of American foreign policy during the Cold War, which is a history that clearly can be in part explained by the distribution of power, the bipolarity with the Soviet Union, the competition. But then the U.S. had motives that could not be explained by that. For Waltz, the invasion of Grenada was something that the U.S. should not have done. For Waltz, the Vietnam episode should not have occurred. For Waltz, the nuclear arms buildup is something that the U.S. did not need to do. Those are all motives that the U.S. could do because it was powerful. Power allowed it to do it, but it doesn't explain why the U.S. wanted to do it. So the motive clearly, which I think is a very important issue in foreign policy, it's a very important issue of foreign policy of every state, but especially the superpowers, was not captured by that paradigm. And a lot of the work that I've been doing since focuses on the sources of the motives, sources of the ideas that give rise to intentions in international politics.
You've touched on an interesting point, which is something that I wanted you to address, which is the extent that this interface between theory and practice. And this evolution of your thinking must have not been unrelated to your increasing interest and involvement in policy issues as they affected the Middle East. Talk a little about that. How does reality help us shape and maybe tweak or change our theories?
Well, you know, I always wonder whether I am just again because of the different components of my own self. You know, not only when I say components, I'm not only talking about the ethnic ones, and those are very obvious, that are always at play because the issues on which I'm focused are always relating to those elements. But also in terms of my own background as someone who had been in mathematics and philosophy and political science and lived played various roles that are competing roles, whether my tendency is not always to try to create harmony within these competing components, whether my sense of being at peace with myself does not drive my wanting to be at peace with my world and to create peace around me, and to therefore reconcile competing traditions, both in international relations or in the policy community. And so I found that by and large, in fact, if you look back at that book, the first book that I did, an aspect that I had not sort of thought about very clearly was trying to deal with this issue of the level of analysis problem, because I certainly believe that individuals matter, and I think Sadat mattered a lot. Even though I say that the Egyptian state was moving in that direction anyway. And so how do I reconcile those two? And I found that essentially the theoretical puzzle for me was to create harmony within these. And so I think there is a lot that comes from my own background that pushes me in that direction. Beyond that, there's also the tradition. I have perhaps a sense of self, who you are. I come from a family tradition of peacemakers. My grandfather was the arbiter in conflicts. People would come to him to arbitrate conflicts, often between different communities, Muslim, Christian, Druze. My father, before he passed away a couple of years ago, played the same role. People would come to him and would go to him to go arbitrate, especially between different communities, not just within community, but across communities, and people reached out to him. And I wonder whether the roles that I ended up playing, both in terms of policy and in terms of theory, were not in part affected by this sense of tradition. Now, again, I may be rationalizing this, one doesn't, but I can't help but notice that there is a tradition that one can say that sort of affects my own sense of self and how I see my role. I must say that I have also evolved, over time. I mean, one can see continuity of the self, and obviously you need to in order to relate to the same person you were 20 years ago. But there's no question that one changes, and I don't think there's a human being who doesn't change, but changes in terms of their own notion of the self and also their own notion of the role. And there was a time, I think perhaps in the past 10 years, I see what I'm doing as a sense of destiny a lot more than I ever felt before, where I see that I was destined to do what I'm doing, that I am well positioned to do what I'm doing, that my understanding of the Arab world and Arab culture and language and so forth, my understanding of Israel and Judaism and my understanding of politics and my understanding of America and my involvement, and all of these come together to give me a sense of destiny that I want to use, and to the extent that I'm already driven by this need to create harmony, it adds to this sense that that I have a role to play, that I'm trying to play.
And you're able to realize this in this very important role as the Anwar Sadat Chair for Peace and Development at Maryland. Let's see where we can go with what you put on the table. And you mentioned that as part of this evolving sense of your own identity and the role that you would play, that you came to focus more on intentions and motivations. Let's get a handle on that by talking about the U.S. role in the Middle East. I know you've emphasized how that role changed, about the time that you were taking that exam that you were talking about earlier. Talk a little about that. What is it? Is it that the region is so complex that the U.S. is limited in its understanding of the region, or is it just caught between a rock and a hard place? On the one hand, supporting Israel; on the other hand, supporting conservative regimes and needing the oil.
Well, if you look at American foreign policy toward the Middle East, there's no question in my mind that it too has been driven by the need to create some harmony between competing interests. We know that during the Cold War, we had, if you read any textbook on American policy toward the Middle East, it will give you three interests. It will say containing the Soviet Union, protecting the flow of oil to the West at reasonable prices, and the commitment to Israel. They would add these three. We know that these three were not always harmonious. We know in 1973 that was the most obvious clash and conflict between them when there was an Arab oil embargo following the 73 war. And I think at least since the mid-70s, the United States has been driven by the need to reconcile these interests through an Arab-Israeli peace process. Because the assumption in American foreign policy since the mid-70s has been that only through reducing the tension between Israel and the Arab states will the U.S. reduce the tension between its competing interests, between its interest in the Arab world on the one hand and its interest and commitment to Israel on the other. That unless that tension is resolved, the tension in American interest is not going to be resolved. And so it has made, in a way, the Arab-Israeli peacemaking an interest of the United States of America as a way of mitigating the broader interest over the long term. What has happened, if you look, historically, you can make an argument that the U.S. has, despite the fact that it's had these interests, it has not had to worry about them as much. The U.S. is strong enough and rich enough that even when there are crises like the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, which is clearly a major crisis, it could address it. But those kind of crises are not the ones that the U.S. has faced historically. In terms of what motivates the U.S. to do what it does domestically, the biggest question has been on what is the source of the commitment to Israel. That really has been the core, I think, question. And here you have different competing views. For a long time, there was a view which said that the commitment to Israel is a corollary to the U.S. Strategic interest, that essentially the U.S. sees Israel as an instrument in its broader strategic interest, containing the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and then later, maintaining the flow of oil, reducing, terrorism, etc. The truth of the matter is that theory just doesn't work, because Israel was, at various stages, very useful strategically, and other stages it was not, viewed strategically to be very important. And even more important, probably, during much of the Cold War, the bureaucracies, the executive bureaucracies, the Defense Department and the State Department, did not view Israel to be a strategic asset, and some of them viewed it to be a detriment. So that just doesn't do it. That explanation simply cannot explain the degree of commitment, which has been significant from 1948. I mean, from the day Israel was established, when Truman recognized the state, and we've had tremendous support, even though we've had episodes of confrontation. But if you look at the political aid, the economic aid, the strategic support, it's been on the up throughout. And so that needs a different explanation. Where does the motive come from? And this is an interesting issue, I think, that is worth exploring. We have a lot of theories, obviously, and theories about moral commitment, which has its own problems. One can look at it and say, well, yes, there is, but why did Truman, for example, have a moral commitment, but not all these others and advisors who were advising him to the contrary? Why? So is that just an accidental fact that you had one moral individual who happened to be the President of the United States? There are a lot of issues like that. In my judgment, it's about politics in America. It's about politics in America, and the track that I have taken for a book that I'm doing about the demographic of national interest, the American political system is about the passion of in particular issues. It's not really about public opinion broadly. It's about how passionate people feel about issues. And you have to ask the question, who cares most deeply about a given issue, to be able to get an answer as to who plays a role. I've done a survey, for example, among the American public, saying, several of them since the 1980s, asking the question, how deeply, for example, do you care about the Arab-Israeli issue? Well, as you can imagine, those who care very deeply about it are a very small segment of the population. And usually about 10% who will place it in the top 5 issues. The rest don't care that much about it. And the opinions of those who care very deeply about it are different. They're not identical to the opinions of the majority of the public. But their opinions coincide much more with policy. When you go into Congress, and I've done a survey within Congress too about their own opinions, members of the House of Representatives, when you look at the structure of committees, the committees are structured to reflect the interests of the members. If you look at the Agricultural Committee, to stray away from the Arab-Israeli conflict, if you look at the makeup of the Agricultural Committee, almost every member of the entire Agricultural Committee is either a farmer or from a farming state. And so would it be a surprise that what you come out of the committee would be in the interest of farmers in the farming states? And then that would be, therefore, the congressional view. It's not a surprise. That's just the way. It's a self-selection process. On foreign affairs, if you look at who joined foreign affairs committees, at least since Vietnam, when foreign affairs committee has not been popular, you find that it's a self-selection process. If you have a constituency that cares about it, you're there. If you don't, you don't. And so, in my judgment, when you look at the demographics of American politics, you look at the role of various groups, Jewish Americans, Arab Americans, and in some instances evangelical Christians who happen to have their own interest in this particular issue, you would find there was a bigger answer as to why you have the support. Much bigger answer about the evolution of the commitment over time than you're going to find either in strategic calculation arguments or in moral arguments.
Would it be fair to say the following, that in a way you've come back to this question of the distribution of power, which guided your work on the Camp David Accords, in this sense that you're really inquiring about the distribution of power internally within the United States, but then also in your readings, I believe I saw that you suggested that one of the problems in resolving the Palestine-Israeli conflict is the maldistribution with so much of the power residing in the Israelis. And if we complete the circle of what you just said, you in essence, the Palestinians don't have a voice in the American political system, and on the ground, in Palestine and Israel, they're politically weak.
Well, it's actually very interesting that you framed it that way, because it's exactly the way I framed it.
Yeah,
and
I hadn't seen
that. And you hadn't seen that, because this is the
yeah.
stuff that I haven't published. But it is interesting, because yes, I think that the core to understanding the emerging ideas in the American political mainstream about interests, the sources of ideas, where do ideas about interest come from, is to understand the distribution of political power in America. And I say political power, not economic power, and I say that deliberately. It's not a Marxist idea. It's not that economic power is not important. I think it is, and we could talk about it in the context of political power. But ultimately, it's a system about voting. And you have to start by figuring out a relationship between the distribution of political power in society and how it transmits itself into American political institutions. I've been arguing in this book that I'm writing that we have seen a transformation of the American political system over the past half a century. The transformation of the national security state, the secret state that emerged in the Cold War, and the broadening it in a way that would reflect much more the democratic nature of the American society. And in the process, we have had a diversification that transmits itself into institutions. We have the diversification of congressional committees. That's the easiest one to do. We have a diversification of the think tanks in America. They have been changed. They used to be dominated by elite groups that were connected to very particular outlooks on life, and they used to have more independence by virtue of having relatively independent sources of money. What has happened in the past several decades is the proliferation of think tanks in America, and those think tanks are much more representative, much more issue-specific think tanks that deal with specific issues, and therefore are more linked to funds that reflect much more the interests of those people who have a stake in those issues that these think tanks study across the American political spectrum, domestic issues as well as foreign policy issues. In the Middle East, we had a proliferation of think tanks dealing with the Middle East. In the old days, it used to be that an institute like the Brookings was the key institute for think tanks on issues like the Middle East. Today, the Brookings, in which I'm involved, is one of many think tanks that are focused strictly on the Middle East, that have a lot more resources because they're only focused on that, but they are dependent on money a lot more than in the past. And they're dependent on Congress more, because what happens in Congress? If you're a member of Congress, you're a chair of a committee, let's say on the Middle East, and you want to invite 3 experts to testify, and you have a position that reflects your own constituency, you're not going to invite someone who's going to make you look like a fool. You're not going to invite someone who's going to defeat your position. You're going to invite someone who's clearly much more in tune with what you have. As a consequence, you go to think tanks that are more reflective of your own views. And therefore, by virtue of going to them, then the testimony is taking place from think tanks that correspond to your views. When think tanks invite you to speak as a featured speaker to get the press to come, you're likely to go to those think tanks which you want to support rather than the others, and it shifts the weight very quickly. Who gets quoted more? Who gets? That's what think tanks want to do. So you have a transformation that has been taking place in think tanks in America, And I would say you have a transformation that has taken place within the executive branch. We have had a thickening of the government on the top, the increasing number of political appointees, the diversification of the State Department bureaucracy itself, more demographically, the intervention of interest groups in the appointment process, a lot more than at any other time in the past. And as a consequence, even the makeup of bureaucracies, and I'm saying that not on this issue in particular, I think it's a broader phenomenon of the change in the American political system, of which the Middle East is only one example, but a very critical example because it's probably a more intense example than the others. You have therefore the grassroots politics ultimately transmitting itself into the nature and power of American institutions. And therefore the ideas that emerge as a consequence are the ideas that are a product of this particular process.
So if we can all agree that the resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict would benefit the region and the world and U.S. foreign policy, what, given the complexity that you've just described, what will bring us to that new plateau of ideas that might lead to a resolution, a satisfactory resolution for both sides to the conflict?
Well, let me first of all say that I do not believe that the United States can impose an Arab-Israeli solution. It just simply cannot. And I'm here, in disagreement with many experts on the Middle East. I do think that the Israelis and the Palestinians, particularly, for them, this is an existential issue. They're not going to give in to the pressure of the United States on the core issues that matter to them. And look at Camp David of the year 2000 between the Palestinians and the Israelis, mediated by the U.S. The Palestinians had a very weak hand. I mean, they're under occupation, they have no military power, they have minimal political clout and economic clout. They are, the President of the United States is invested in having a settlement. Israel is powerful, and you have a desperate need by Israel and the United States to want a settlement. And they offered a lot, but certainly not enough for the Palestinians, and Arafat rejected it. And they couldn't impose a solution on him. Weak as he is, he could walk away and reject it. Yes, he got blamed, he's paying a price, but he did not believe this was going to meet his minimal national security requirements, and he didn't accept it. The U.S. is certainly not going to be able to do it on Israel. I mean, if they can't do it on the Palestinians, it's not going to be able to do it in Israel. But what the U.S. can and needs to do is create space for them to transcend their domestic politics. They
being the Palestinians.
Both the Palestinians and the Israelis,
yeah.
Both of them. Because what is happening is they're both hostage to a process that they cannot break out of. You cannot create space for yourself when every single day you're hopping from one funeral to another in both communities. You're not going to be able to somehow sit back and there are very few people who are like a Sadat or like a Mandela. And we can't expect, therefore, that we can await such time to have the emergence of someone like a Nelson Mandela to be the leader of the Israelis or the Palestinians. Those are few and far in between. You can't base a policy based on the dream of having someone like that in place. In general, when Sharon does what he does, like go into the Israeli cities and in the process kill many Palestinians and lose any political support on the Palestinian side for a settlement, he is doing it not because it works, that is in addressing violence, because we see, despite of what Sharon has done since he's been in power, Israelis lost more casualties than at any time in recent years. That Israel has paid a heavier price. Rather than violence coming under control, they're increasingly paying a heavy price. And there is no end in sight, and there is no solution in sight. So he's making the Palestinians pay a heavy price, but only by making the Israelis pay a heavy price. How do we justify it? Well, we justify it by, this is what his public opinion demands. This is what the public demands. Well, yes, that's right. But public opinion is driving both into a self-destructive mode. And you need to have space. What you have in a situation like that is the moderates on both sides who want a deal, who, by the way, are a majority. Every single poll tells us, on the Palestinian side, on the Israeli side, moderates, that is, people who want a political negotiated settlement on the basis of territorial compromise, are a majority among Israelis and Palestinians. But those moderates have nothing to point to in order to be able to counter the extremists who say, let's use violence. Because the Israeli moderates will say, well, we tried it at Camp David, it failed, what are we going to do? They give up. And the Palestinians say, what are we going to do? The Israelis are not going to give us what we need. What else do we have? So what you need to do is a external intervention that does require some short-term pressure, yes. It's not a pressure on existential issues. It's not a pressure on the ultimate shape of an agreement, but pressure in the short term to make them overcome the public opinion problems and to bring them into a process that opens up possibilities that would then rally support and open up domestic space for each one of them to be able to pursue the objectives. And that is, of course, under the best of circumstances. That is assuming that you have governments in both places that want a solution. I actually think, and this is probably in part the evolution of my own ideas over time, that I do not take what a leader says as his objectives at face value. I would think that Sharon ultimately is a politician. There are some who are ideologically committed, but Sharon ultimately is a politician. He wants to succeed. He wants to get elected. He wants to be popular. If he was elected to end violence, he doesn't. He's defeated. If he sees that public opinion is emerging that wants him to make an agreement, he's going to move in that direction. I think that leaders reflect the environment around them. They can affect it, no question. They can sometimes transcend it. But by and large, their positions are fluid. They're not as fixed as some people assume.
And how do ideas matter in this context, shape that environment so politicians like Sharon and Arafat, for that matter, respond?
What we have, for example, is we have a narrative that emerged after Camp David.
The most recent Camp David.
The most recent Camp David of 2000 between Israel and the Palestinians. Once that those negotiations collapsed, you had a prevailing paradigm in the Israeli arena and a counter paradigm in the Palestinian arena. In Israel, there's an interpretation that you can't penetrate right now, which says the Palestinians were given everything, and they rejected it. And they rejected it because they really don't want to accept Israel as a state. And they initiated the Intifada because ultimately they want nothing short of the destruction of Israel. And this is all tactical. And you have majorities of Israelis believing that. And that's an idea. And if you believe in that idea, it's going to be impossible to find out. On the Palestinian side, you have a counter idea, which is they offered us nothing. They offered us very, very little. They wanted to fragment us into Bantustans in the West Bank and Gaza and control us and not give us real sovereignty. They wanted to control Jerusalem. And they wanted to impose it on us, take it or leave it, use the military power and send Sharon to the Haram al-Sharif in order to cow us into accepting what we simply cannot accept. And so they have two prevailing paradigms that are clearly not in touch with reality, per se. There's a lot of blame to go around. There's some shades of truth to both, but not quite accurate. But there are ideas that are dominant, and they dominate the mainstream. They don't only dominate the fringe. And that really cripples the politics of reconciliation. It cripples the moderates. And one has to find a way to transcend that, to break through that. I must say that I understand how hard it is to penetrate those ideas. Usually it happens, we think that they're almost impossible to penetrate. But then you look back at it and you see how individual acts of leadership can do a lot. I mean, look at what Sadat did, to mention Sadat. And I'm not, one can be critical of what he did or didn't do here and there. I mean, he was by no means a perfect man, but he was a great man in the sense that he understood the power of leadership. And he understood the power of psychology. And he understood that the way to break a paradigm is through bold acts of leadership. And when he went to the Knesset in Israel, which shocked everyone, if you read his speech at the Knesset in Israel in 1977, that speech was the same repeat of the same position that he has been saying for a long time. He didn't say all that much new. He did say some very important things. No more war to the Israelis. But the very act of him going there to accept Israel suddenly transformed the psychology about the possibility of peace. The psychology that was all the psychology of war. You can't ever deal with Arab leaders. And yet here's the man who waged the Arabs' most successful war in 1973 against them, who was the leader of the greatest Arab nation, the nation that has led Pan-Arabism in the region, getting on the airplane and going to the Knesset and speaking to them. It was an act. In recent months, by the way, you find that a very small speech by a single Palestinian, Sari Nusseibeh, who was appointed by Mr. Arafat to replace Faisal Husseini to be in charge of Jerusalem affairs. He's a president of Al-Quds University, a respected academic, himself a philosopher. He went and gave a speech at the Hebrew University in which he said, Israelis should become our closest allies. We should compromise on the issue of refugees so as not to threaten the security of Israel. It's amazing how much debate that has created in the Israeli arena, in the American Jewish arena, in terms of the possibilities suddenly that people see, well, maybe in fact there is room for a deal. On the Israeli side, you need to have something like that. At the leadership level, since the election of the Sharon government, we really haven't seen anything of that sort either. There needs to be things of that sort. Ultimately, it's acts that help break these cycles, not ideas.
Acts by leaders.
By leaders.
Yeah. Well, how do you think the events of 9/11 will reshape the influence of ideas, of leadership, and of peace processes that we've been describing?
Well, it's interesting. I am not sure the extent to which the region has fully internalized the change 9/11 has created, certainly in the U.S., but probably in much of the world. And in a way, in the short term, both of them, that is the Arab states, but especially the Palestinians and the Israelis, have behaved tactically. They've looked at it as a short-term crisis that they have to find a way to get around until they go back to normal politics. And so what you've seen is that the Sharon government thought maybe now the world will be more sympathetic with us on terrorism, and we can use this to paint the Palestinians as terrorists, and and certainly the attention will be focused elsewhere. We could do more to confront the Palestinians. The Palestinians saw it as maybe this is a way to get closer to the U.S. and to build a relationship with the U.S. Tactically, so as to have them pressure the Israelis. The Arab world saw it as an opportunity for a new coalition, a la Gulf War, that would also create new political alliances and would change the strategic situation in their favor. The Israelis, therefore, are very uncomfortable with the idea of coalitions. They want unilateralism because they fear that coalitions are going to translate into pressure on them. All of that, in my judgment, is tactical. And when I say tactical, I think none of them is coming to grips with what I see as a much more profound problem. And the profound problem really is within the region itself and at the global level. And they all could become victims of it, that they have much more in common anyway on this war on terrorism. Not because I see this, the terrorism is used as a cliche now, obviously, But I do think that there has been a dynamic in both societies that neither society has come to grips with sufficiently. In the Arab Middle East and really beyond the Arab Middle East, in the region as a whole, you have a psychology which has not empowered the vast majorities, the silent majorities, who really basically are moderate in their inclinations, who want ordinary, normal lives, who want to create spaces that would create more hope for their families, who are reconcile themselves to the need for compromise on political issues, including ones with Israel. And fringe, which is not only extremist but militant, that is using violence as a method, and especially violence against civilians, which is the worst of all kind. And I think that what we have seen, because of the frustration of the region with much of the world, the sense of dependence of the region on much of the world, and especially on the U.S., the anger that they have toward the world and the U.S., what we've seen is that those majorities have looked at this conflict as if they're bystanders, as if the conflict is between the U.S. and its supporters and some extremist fringe or militants that they don't like, but it's their problem, not ours. Mm-hmm. That is the worst of all possibilities, because I think what they need to see in it is that their own lives are at stake. You do have people who have come to grips with that. You have intellectuals asking the question, do we want a bin Laden-dominated Middle East? Do we want a Taliban world? This is not what we want, and they understand the risks to them, although they don't think these are imminent risks. So they're different. You even had articles by Arab intellectuals saying that the threat to America was a threat to their own dream, because America is a metaphor. America isn't merely the superpower. It's a lot of people are angry with America, but they love America. They aspire to be American. They want American goods. They want American products. They want to live the American life. They want to have the freedom that America provides. And so the 9/11 presented a threat to that idea. Those people are few and far in between, certainly the ones who articulate and express those views. And when they go on television, which has become very influential in the past decade, we have a proliferation of new media in the Middle East that is highly watched and more independent than in the past. When you have a debate between those moderates and between the militants or their supporters, the moderates simply go on the defensive. They do not have something to offer. They have no vision, no idea, no future, in part because there's no mechanism for them. There's no packages in front of them to point to. In the 1990s, we had a package like that that followed the Gulf War.
The Oslo Accords.
The Oslo process, but also a promise of prosperity. Remember that after the Madrid conference that came after the Gulf promised a new Middle East, linked to the world, based on negotiated settlements between Israel and the Arabs, but also based on economic development, prosperity, and possibly even political development. By the end of the decade, the whole thing collapsed. The negotiations collapsed. Prosperity never materialized. In some instances, things went from bad to worse. And there was a loss of hope, a loss of inspiration. And there's no package on the table like that today.
Shibley, I'm afraid our time is up, but thank you very much for sharing with us the story of your intellectual journey and relating that to this conundrum of problems in the Middle East. I think it's very clear that the complexity of our ideas has to grow if we're to have the understanding to come to terms with these problems in the way, I guess, that your father and grandfather did in the village in the Middle East. Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.